All right, we're live.
Hey.
Here we are. Hi, Greg. Hi, everyone. All right, we are. Confirmation, we are live. So I wanted to, well, first of all, thank you, Greg, for writing this book, but also for having me here for this launch. And everyone who is here to this conversation hosted by the Radical Books Collective. My name is Chelsea Stieber. I teach French and Francophone studies at Catholic University. And here I am here with the author of this wonderful book, Decolonize Hipsters, by Grégory Pierrot, who is associate professor at the University of Connecticut, author of other books, actually, recently of The Black Avenger in Atlantic Culture, as well as a really exciting forthcoming anthology of Haitian revolutionary fictions, the University of Virginia Press, which is co-edited with Marlena Doubt and Marian Ruff-Leitner. Thank you. And also really a bunch of cool projects that are sort of associated with both the Radical Books Project and decolonization more broadly. Most recently, this wonderful Los Angeles Review of Books project too. So maybe we can link to all of that as well. So because this is a launch, because I get to ask the first question, although please, everyone, ask your questions on social media so that we can engage them in this conversation. My first question really is just sort of to get us into the book. And maybe first, for those who are not familiar, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, I'll say a few words about it myself, although, of course, Greg can also speak to it as he is the author. But Decolonize Hipsters is a brilliant handbook for the revolutionary overthrow of embedded colonial ideas, the series with OR Books. It lays bare hipsterdom's deep connections to processes of colonization, Black cultural appropriation, and white supremacy. It is as much about hipsters as it is about race in the Atlantic world because, as Greg shows in the book, hipsterdom is deeply colonial. Its fascination with, scorn for, and theft of Black culture is inexplicably tied to the Atlantic slave trade. And fascism, which I guess that's kind of the way in that I want to start, which is to say that, I'm interested in all of this book, but I think something that really brought me into it was the question of fascism. And I want to kind of get to that via a question that I am not as familiar with, which is music. So music is a huge part of the book. You recently contributed a revolutionary playlist to the Polis Project's list of revolutionary playlists. That's very cool. Everyone should go check it out. But so I wanted you to talk a little bit about your relationship to music and how this became such an anchor piece of the book. And again, not just the site of extraction and theft and commercialization of Black culture, but also, as you suggest, via Woody Guthrie's guitar, a machine that kills fascism.
Ooh, first, thank you, Chelsea, for being here and for doing this. Very much at the last minute. You are great. I'm saying this for everyone here. If you didn't know, Chelsea's great. Again, the first thing I thought about when you asked the question was, what I guess the musical scene was like that I grew up in, so to speak. And, I always listened to a lot of different musics, but the first scene I sort of got into, let's say back in France in the early 90s was, punk rock and alternative music. Locally and more broadly, this was a particular scene that was always always in my lifetime in any case, and around me, very political and very much on a cusp, right? We'd go to concerts and you'd find communist skinheads and Nazi skinheads, right? In different, sometimes at different corners of the same room. You'd go to, say, a ska concert and you'd definitely find both of these and others. Music and politics were always, tied and very much on the surface and very much a question of style and very much essential in this sense, right? I mean, it was very important to know what a Nazi skinhead looked like as opposed to, say, a communist skinhead. It could be a matter of serious bodily, I don't want to say survival, but, potentially. And so, in this way, I would say certain kinds of, maybe, somewhat Eurocentric, I want to say, to at least in my first experience of them, musical scenes and pop cultures were always imbued with those questions, right? I can't really separate the way I got into or interested into politics from the way I got interested in certain kinds of music. There was no clear separation between those different domains, right? I mean, in those, I don't want to say daily life, but like, immediate experience of it. And, as I grew and learned about other things, it became also clear to me that even those things that seem so white, right? Even all those scenes were never exclusively white, but were always, majoritarily white, weren't just white either, right? Again, this was partly education, but this was also very much experience, right? Realizing this, just for myself, for family in some cases, but also learning about different genres and where they came from. So, not to be too abstract and maybe too general here, but that certainly fed into the book, right? I mean, some of these reflections and ideas I've literally thought about, for a lifetime. I don't want to say necessarily in very articulated fashion, but when I started making fanzines with my sister when I was 12 or 13 or whatever, we actually were already thinking about those things, maybe not in exactly the same terms. But so in this way, it's really an ongoing reflection, right? Which in the case of the book, it's only impacted by more recent developments.
You anticipated. I wanted to follow up and kind of know where you'd been thinking and writing about it before, thinking about experimental zines and things like that. And I think, I want to talk maybe about style in the writing process later, if those questions come up. But thinking about your way in, I know that you had sort of a dialogue, and that this was really a way for you to fit in some of that thinking into sort of a radical collective, or at the very least the book series. And so, where else have you done this thinking? In what forms, and what allowed you to sort of take this form, and sort of how was that process for you?
So yeah, I guess I started speaking about this, but so I was blessed with an older sister whose name is Peggy. I don't think she's watching this, so I can say whatever I want. But they're all gonna be good things. Just don't let her know. And so, a lot of things we just did together, right? She's 4 years older than I am, so she took me to all my first concerts. We played music together, and we wrote together. When she was in high school and I was still in middle school, she started making fanzines, and it just came naturally that I would be part of it. So the first articles I ever wrote were for those fanzines. This necessarily won't say anything to people outside of France, but I grew up in Metz in eastern France. She went to high school in Nancy, big rival city, but rival city with an actual musical scene, which was, so there were all those great concerts to go see and bands you could interview, somewhat easily, and so, I guess, well, again, anyway, fanzines happened, and so I started writing, and at that time, and the writing style for fanzines obviously is just a free for all. We just did whatever the hell we wanted, because we had no idea again who was reading it, and we didn't really care, right? That's the point, right? You speak about music you like, and bands you like, and films you like, and books you like, and whatever, and then maybe people read it, and then maybe they don't, and it doesn't matter, right? It's great. And we transitioned into a webzine in the late 90s, where I think all those forms sort of reflected our personal evolution, I want to say. Topics got there was always a little bit of cultural analysis and politics, I guess, but we just got older and maybe smarter, and get more references and connections to make. And so in the late 90s, and early 2000s, we started a webzine called melanine.org, that was really just a continuation of what we'd been doing on paper. And got maybe more political than the fanzines were, but essentially it was the same idea, right? We talked mostly about music, film, books, and what those things meant, and connections that we thought seemed interesting. Yeah, I don't want to downplay it, right? I mean, but fanzines are, I want to say they're an interesting training, I guess. Precisely because, again, you can't really take it too seriously. If you're lucky if you sell 20 of them, if you sell any of them, it seems only your friends read them. You don't really know, right? I mean, you can't really. There's no you can't have too big a head with this stuff, because you literally have no idea where it goes. I mean, I guess you could be serious about it, but so again, that was the training, and that was also the style, right? I want to say this was very non-academic, because that's not the kind of writing it is, and so this was sort of going back to that, right, in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I want to go and spend more time on melanine.org and sort of find the pseudonyms and the different essays and spend time with that, because one of the things that I so enjoyed, I mean, so many things about the book, but was really just being in that style and getting to sort of play along and be along, but also play myself with that style. And in academic writing, that is not something that we get to do as much, or maybe we should be doing more of. But yeah, I found it to be humor and truth, and also a dialogue and a conversation. It's just interesting to think about this sort of genesis, or at least thinking about these earlier experiences of writing that were for you based in a conversation and in a sort of a collective, at the very least with your sister, but obviously with other people, and how that to me really comes through in the reading. So yeah, I appreciate that background. I want to maybe, let's see. All right, I want to encourage people again to submit questions so that we can continue to engage with the audience in conversation. But I'm going to keep going then with some of my questions, which again, for maybe people who haven't gotten a chance to read the book, who might be interested, I want you to kind of give us the point of you doing this sort of analysis of the idea or the concept of hip in Hipster. And with that, I want to, so you can just give that overview, but I want you to also maybe tell us whether you didn't go after the word cool enough, or what, I know cool is related. I found myself wanting to say cool in some of my questions, and I was like, but is cool as problematic as hip? Or where is cool in relation to hip? I mean, you use it a lot in the book critically, and so I just wonder if you could maybe talk about cool and hip too.
Well, I want to say, to me, yeah. So I guess it's one of those things. So it's the more seriously you talk about it, the more it becomes what am I doing? Well, to me, hip is more I think it engages more directly the way people relate to certain notions, right? Hip is to be aware of some things, right? To be aware of what is cool, I guess, if that makes sense. So I would say maybe that's the difference. The cool is more a more general state of being, I guess, or a state of doing. While hip is to me insists on the awareness of what that means. And I guess we sort of started talking about that a little bit at the end of the book club earlier, which you weren't there, so I'm just revealing this to you now. But to me, there is something about that, right? Awareness, and then self-awareness, and then awareness of self-awareness, and so on, right? Because hip implies, again, an in and an out group, right? Your hip is that something that a majority of people don't really know, whether that's true or not, right? That's sort of what it rests on. And in the book club, somebody asked about sort of references and in jokes, and that there were some or maybe too many in the book, and what that means. And I guess that's an inevitable function of the topic to me, right? I mean, it is about things that some people might know and that others might not know, and that you might not want others to know on purpose, right? I mean, again, you make an in-group, or you don't build it in this way, but there's a line there, right? There's those who are in the know and those who are not. Cool, I think, is just sort of a broader notion in this way, right? Like hip to me is really more about it is about, again, awareness and self-awareness, I guess.
Ooh, I'm glad I wasn't in the book club at the end because I did have to eat lunch, but I'm sad because I really would have liked to have, maybe I would have taken the conversation in a way that wouldn't have been as open for people who haven't read the book and who are just coming to the launch. But you're touching on a lot of things that I want to kind of follow up on. So the reason I asked you the question about cool is that I am interested too in the concept of cool hunting that you, or the practice of cool hunting really, that you sort of take to task and you highlight as I would say extremely problematic in the book, insofar as it is an economy of attention, actually of money, right? Of people cool hunting for things that they can purchase or be a part of, but also of sort of one's efforts. Like you can cool hunt and spend all your time cool hunting and like create your island of one in this sea of racial capitalism and kind of be okay because you're going through this process. And then there's this in-group, out-group sort of construction of sort of lines and of boundaries and of opacity or of indecipherability that I think also really, I want to hear you kind of tease out into sort of what you're talking about in terms of extraction and again, of racial capitalism, which is that there are necessary or there are sometimes survivalist creations of sort of those lines and those boundaries from racialized violence or from extraction that is itself violent. And then there's also the cool hunting piece of it that, I mean, you do this all in the book, so I'm sort of regurgitating some of that, but I want you to kind of speak to that maybe, which is where I was thinking about going with cool. And I'm just going to read this because I found it online and I'm now regretting that because the Google algorithm is going to keep feeding me this website, which I don't want to get, but there we go. It's Cool Hunting, registered trademark. I'm just going to read the description of it. It's an award-winning independent publication that uncovers the latest intersections of design, culture, and technology. We are a team of writers and editors whose curiosity fuels an ongoing quest for the discovery of true inspiration. We leverage our access, insights, and knowledge not only to find this, but also to share it with you. And like, eek, right? Like I'm just thinking about where decolonize hipsters into the whole sort of framework of this radical decolonial project. Like, ooh, that's so colonial, and anyway. Part of what's so interesting about thinking with this book and extrapolating it to so much else is that it really lays bare how this operates everywhere in our sort of late capitalist world.
Yeah, I mean, the metaphors keep coming, right? I mean, there's a way in which, I was thinking about, okay, that's a very deep cut, but I'll try to, I don't know, okay, maybe I'll get back to that. No, actually, I'll just try to. So there's this guy, some people are familiar with France might be aware of this guy, called Alain Soral, who's sort of a figure of like French neo-fascism. Now, if you know him only for that reason, you may not be aware of his career prior to this. He was, this sort of guy, like for a time, what his specialty was the analysis of so-called urban tribes, right? Like he had this book that I still remember, that was a guide to subcultures, and that would have, I don't know, the skinhead, and it would be like a graph or a drawing with like, what does a skinhead wear? And, and they would do this for every, so-called, subculture, right? He wrote that guide. Now he's just this figure of French fascism. And again, I mean, to me, that, again, he's sort of the embodiment of part of what I want to talk about in the book, right? There's no surprise there, right? That he would have done this, 20, 30 years before becoming this sort of a new French fascist is not really surprising to me, right? There's something about the taxonomy, the sort of revealing secrets, the sheer colonialism of it, the cool hunting of it, that is, very directly connected to this. And so I think to go back to what you were saying, there are fundamentally different ways of approaching this, I want to say. And as I say this, I also don't want to say that they're like, essentially different, but there are situations in which being part of that in-group is indeed part of, it's about survival, right? It is not about being cool. It's that being cool is how you live, or how you keep living, if that makes sense, right? And so, one line that I think makes that clear, that I talk about in the book, is just how much of that cool derives from cultural practices of the enslaved, right, and of the oppressed, and more generally speaking, not to be too general. In which case, again, you can look at it just like cultural phenomena and just miss out on the fact that culture doesn't just come for people's entertainment. Culture is life, right? Culture means something. You don't do music just because it sounds good, as it turns out. You don't wear certain clothes just because they look cool, even though they do look cool, right? And to me, so what we see with hipsters is the sort of the systematic, commodification of that dynamic, right? Quite simply. And that's fashion, and that's other sort of a dilution of subculture and cultural phenomenon. Right? At some level, it's always the same thing. People create this, and a small group knows it, and then it gets everywhere, and then we move on and whatnot. It's been sucked dry. We can move on to something else that's going to be good. But what I think is important here, and generally speaking, is to keep in mind that more often than not, those phenomena, those early in groups, have an involvement in it that means something deeper than just not telling your neighbor what you're talking about, right? Again, in the book, I think I made clear that some of the in language is also quite literally a language of survival. I think in some cases, maybe more metaphorically, obviously, than when you had to survive being enslaved in enslaved societies around the New World. But I think that remains, right, in many ways. And I think, maybe a crucial difference in hipsterdom is that it copies the dynamic, but it doesn't need it. Quite simply, right? It is something to consume.
Oh, but this gets to this thought I've been having. I mean, I don't want to get. I want to get to the end, but I don't want to get to the end yet. This question of survival. It's so. There's survival, like as in actual life or death, which again, stakes that you make clear in some parts of the book. And there are, there are sort of, there's a scale of that to some degree, but you're putting it really in the sort of the plantation and in Jim Crow and in sort of these extremely violent, real sort of scenarios. And then there's this sort of like, it's not a sick copy, but it's like this idea that like to a degree, and I guess I'm asking you to respond to this idea, like do hipsters, or rather maybe it's the sort of like elder, this is book club sort of talk, so I'll try and define it. Later millennial, liberal sort of commodity, like already sort of entrenched in the system idea of cool, where in a sense they're hipsterdom, or not their hipsterdom, but their cool hunting and their energy that they're spending doing that allows them to survive, quote unquote, in sort of a very, a system that they can't change, or sort of a capitalist system that is totally uninterested in any of their individuality or any of their political thought, right? So like, is there something that links those two survivals as sort of grotesque as that is to try to do?
I think, again, I think the latter, the hipster survival to me is, I think I recycled that Marx, quote about the history as drama and then farce, right? Everybody's heard it a million times, but to me that is, it's not about way of defining what this is about, right? What's his name? Dennis Sinnett, who writes a lot about gentrification in Brooklyn. He has a pretty great blog about this, was talking quite about people living in Brooklyn right now and saying, in a nutshell, I'm simplifying drastically here, but talking to people who basically, pushed people out that used to live there just, by pricing them out, right? Whether or not that's what they meant, that's what happened. And saying that how they now speak of, the problems of the area in the same terms, as if they were actually somehow being oppressed in their position as, whoever, now owns the condo, or maybe they don't own it and that's their oppression, right? And there's a way in which, the discourse of survival becomes part of what is also consumed and borrowed, right? And appropriated. And I think, to some extent it shows, again, a different level of awareness of the, if not the history of this, right? But the discourse of it, right? And I think it's interesting what you said, where it's like, the system doesn't care about the individuality. I'm not so sure about that. I think that's all it cares about, if only because it allows to bypass collective action, quite simply. I mean, again, maybe too simply, but there's a way in which these grievances, right, which always come down to the individual, replace any other grievances. Right? I mean, it's not about the people that were forced out and had to figure out where else to live, right? It's about them struggling with God knows what at that moment. I'm not saying these aren't valid grievances, but they obviously ignore like how they participate in a bigger system and how they potentially help put other people in trouble, right? I mean, again, being very, very general, but I think the discourse here that I connect with hipsterdom actually, again, is very much about borrowing and taking everything, including that language, right? And that to me is interesting because I don't think it's quite adapted to the situation, but it becomes adapted to the situation.
Well, so that, I mean, you're bringing me to this end question, but we'll come back to earlier parts. Because actually this individuality is really, in requiring that people remain individual and that their individual desires sort of can be fulfilled, or that those desires are themselves shaped or dictated, is really, I think, where we get to at the end. But I want you to kind of respond to this, me sort of reacting to this and what you're doing in the end, because it's so, in my mind, profound or powerful, both. But it also is, it also to me is sort of, I don't want to say tragic, because that brings us to a lot of other things, but whatever. It part of it feels a little tragic, and I'll explain why. But so yeah, I back to this idea of cool hunting and of this idea of like individual sort of really basically spending time, money, energy, effort to hunt cool and to create their cool. Again, I'm calling it an island of one or a party of one, as sort of rafts to float on, or little islands to gardens or whatever in this extremely violent system. But so what I read in the end is like this hope that energy, that there is an army, or that there's an energy, time, effort, money that could be redirected to something else. It's not, right, but it's there, or at least that's what I'm reading as hope. And so I guess the question kind of is, is that what you're saying? And also then, in addition to that, like who, and I'm going to maybe answer that, and then I'll just read, or ask you to read if you have the book, because there's one part that I really want to ask you about. But yeah, I'll ask that first question.
So that's what I hope.
You do hope. I mean, now I'm like, are you hopeful?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I mean, again, I'm gonna have to cite Marx again. Somebody's gonna beat me up. That is probably what is it, like the situation is so dire that it fills me with hope. I'm a pessimist, but I think that also means I'm hopeful. I don't know, what else is there to do, right? I mean, I don't. So maybe to go back to what I think you were saying, I think that the as you said, the energy is what's interesting here, right? And I don't think it's individual, and I think again, like making it into an individual trajectory is the the endless issue here. Of course, I mean, again, not to simplify things, but we're it was interesting. Like, yeah, there's a way to me in which 21st century hipsterdom sort of made all of this, or made it seem like it was always individual, right? Like, again, you can take this here and there, and like you put it all together, and ta-da, that's it. Like you're this cool monad, right? And what's cool about you is that your borrowings are combined in this unique way. It's like, oh, but I only have a dash of this, and a whole bit of that, and 25% of punk or whatever. And I hope it sounds ridiculous, because I'm trying to make it sound ridiculous, but it also isn't, right? Like, it doesn't have to be, let's say. But what to me it becomes sort of the issue here is that then it sort of makes it sound like, yeah, you're doing this on your own. Michael Bronner earlier, I think, was in the book club, was saying, there's a way in which the pretense of originality is part of the problem, right? Always make it sound like it's new when it's not new, and it's not like we don't come up with new combinations or whatever, but like the insistence on the new and the insistence on the individual, to me, are the same, right? And they take away from the other option, which is that, yeah, no, we are groups, actually, and we could be doing this together. Again, is that hopeful? Is that naive? Maybe. Is that hopeful? Certainly. But interestingly enough, to me, that was what was happening what kept happening with a lot of those in groups and their dilution, right? Which is like, there's a way in which dilution makes it sound like, oh, now everybody's doing it, so it doesn't mean anything. And that's sort of it, but like, I feel like dilution was always also making it like, now you right here with that Uncle Sam finger, right? Like, you can do it too. Mm-hmm. And that is the problem, because it's not, it's about you joining groups. It's not about you doing it for yourself, right? And I feel like, again, hipsterdom sort of mechanized that individualization. Oh, I want to say fake individualization, because in the end, it's not really, I mean, I'm sure it does a lot to Instagram accounts and whatnot, but it doesn't really do much even for individuals, or maybe whatever. I'm sure it does, but you know what I mean, right? Like, what it takes away from is exactly how we belong to groups, right? And that to me is the nefarious aspect of it.
Wow. Not sure. No. That makes I mean, yeah, I get your hope, but also the newness and the individuality being sort of one piece, which is to say that the past and the continued sort of collective groups that do have history and power and lessons continually being, made new or silenced. And I guess, because I want to take up this question from Michael that gets to a larger sort of question of the book, and it's right here beamed up. Can the hipster really be decolonized?
No. Oh! No, I don't know. I don't actually think so. Not to the extent that, I mean, again, though I was joking. I mean, I mentioned it in the book, and again, we were just talking about this a little bit, but nobody's a hipster, right? Nobody claims to be one. If you're one, it's because somebody else is pointing at you, right, and telling you that you are. Nobody wants to be one, and yet there have to be hipsters, right? It's just not a label that you give yourself, which I think is interesting, because it sort of implies that everybody knows there's something problematic about it in the first place. Even people who have to be aware that they might fit the label, right? To me, as far as decolonization is concerned, it can be because the hipster is sort of both, the avant-garde and the result of colonization. So in this sense, I don't think you can't be a hipster and be decolonized at the same time. I think if you decolonize a hipster, then the hipster becomes something else. If that makes sense. So I mean, to that extent, I don't think we can. We have to turn to something else, right? Hipsters, I think, by definition, are colonial. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, That's a good, I think for Michael's question, and it doesn't, right, it's not a yes or a no. I mean, you in the book you say undo, and I wonder if that, what that choice is, whether or not it's that last passage. But with that, because this gets to sort of this question of that there absolutely are hipsters and no one wants to be the one, but you use a your, there's a you, right, to the reader. And I wonder if you could tell us more about who that is or what you're envisioning. And that's the last page 138. That's it then, your directive to undo the hipster, embrace the John Brown under the beard.
Well, I am talking to white people, in case that was unclear. Not that I think you have to be white to be a hipster. I think it's you will find non-white hipsters, but I do sincerely think that there's and especially again in this most recent iteration, in some ways, as we've seen, like historically, hipster before it becomes, there's a window there where the term also actually defines people in the in-group of, in this case, the jazz scene, in the 30s, right? Before it becomes the term you use for those white people who are entering the jazz scene, whether they're welcome or not, right? At this point, I don't think that confusion or that broadness exists any longer. So yeah, I mean, in this sense, yeah, I'm talking to, in some ways, to not strictly to white people, but very much to white people. Again, and again, I don't think the responsibility is strictly on white people, but as far as hipsters are concerned, and that phenomenon, I do think it's inseparable from whiteness. So yeah, that's you.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think, and I mean, whether or not it's just interesting to think about the readership and think about how it gets there. I think all of it does a very good job of catching sort of an audience that it needs to catch. But I wonder if you, do you think there's did you think about this as like a delivery mechanism, if that makes sense? Was there a sort of how, right, thinking about your audience, or did that become sort of like, if this is if I could put together sort of a short, blurb for call to action, if you will, that was when you sort of thought about delivery and thought about audience?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want, I feel that would be maybe not humble enough, right? In a way, I'm not like, I don't want to call people to action in that way, Mm-hmm. And again, to be clear, to go back to what I was saying, yeah, that's what I'm doing here, but I'm not fully, it's not like I'm not part of that potential audience either. I'm just the one writing, so I mean, I get to say things.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also more general. I mean, I think it's a call, generally speaking, that I think very obviously applies to me as well. I don't think I think we could all do more. That certainly means me as well. I think that there's much more involvement to be had. There are many more things to be done. And in that way, I think it applies to anyone who might feel targeted or not, for that matter. You don't have to. The John Brown bit is very obviously related to whiteness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I like John Brown. I certainly feel like he's done more things than I have. So I mean, to that extent, I think people who might not feel like the "you" is directed at them might still, consider the call in more abstract ways, right? I think that there's a way in which that's never not true. That we could all be doing more and get more involved, and so yeah, to that extent, I think it's a call. But again, like I want to make clear, right? That certainly does not come from a place of what are you doing? Well, look at me, I wrote a book.
You're not Uncle Samming it in your own way.
No, I hope I'm not. No. It's it's meant to be like partly, to be honest, it was also like people said, well, so what do you propose? I'll propose anything, but if you do want to call, well, here it is, right? I'm not sure what we could do, but I think we could do other things, right? So,
yeah. No, I think reading the book is a really good start. So I'm, yeah. I want you to, we're gonna get to you doing a reading, which I am excited to hear. And I don't have a passage that I necessarily have in mind. So maybe you can think about that while I also ask you another hard question. Not hard, just, one that will involve thought. So if you can think about two things at once. But then I can also suggest one if you really don't want to come up with one.
I don't mind you suggesting one because
but so I think maybe in some ways it seems unfair to end on this question. So maybe we'll have time to squeeze another one in if someone who is, okay, good. Meg's got a question too. So and this actually will tie into the question that I have. So Meg, I don't know if we can beam this question up, but she's asking, can hipness and gentrification be disentangled? Is there gentrification without the hipster? And sort of one of my questions that I wanted to ask was about, maybe I'll back up. I think there are many things that make great books, but something that I find that makes this a great book and that I think makes your other book a great book is that you are able to take a concept and you do such a deep and careful job of looking at it historically, of tracing its evolution and picking your ways into it that are by no means exhaustive, but that it becomes great when, in fact, it becomes extremely applicable to any number of other cultural objects or phenomena. So with the Black Avenger, there are many other I read your book and then I was like, Black Avengers, right? It highlights and it illustrates. And I think the book does the exact same thing. And I also understand in 138 pages, that's you can't do everything. I think gentrification is maybe one of those that could have been another chapter in and of itself. And so I wonder maybe if you could talk about some of the other things that are absolutely part of this larger framework that could have been chapters or ways in, including potentially gentrification.
Mm-hmm. To go to Meg's question, I think hipness and gentrification can be disentangled. Is there gentrification without the hipster? I want to say, I don't know that gentrification works the same way absolutely everywhere. So I want to say that there may be a gentrification without the hipster. Certainly, I'm thinking of this sort of urban urban gentrification specifically, right? The way areas that often, at least in some cases, were first a very upper class and then became more working class and now are becoming upper class again. I think that specific cycle, as I don't want to say always, but certainly uses hipsters or at least artists in an interesting way, right? Or at least, a sense of cool, right? That's definitely become part of that cycle. In that, that's sort of the vanguard of gentrification have to be people who blunt the impact of what's coming after them, right, in some ways, that do find genuine interest often in living in areas that not just because maybe they might be cheaper or whatever reason brings. That tends to be the reason why artists move into a certain working class neighborhood. But it is their presence that it certainly participates. I want to say symbolically, often maybe more than actually economically in bringing the waves of gentrifiers, right? I don't blame artists for this, but they whether they like it or not, they serve they have this sort of cultural capital that I think becomes part of that wave, right? Again, maybe not to generalize. I don't know that it's always the case, but in some of the places we talked about, and certainly in New York City, it's still moving, right? It's been moving east in this weird way, in the past 50 years or so. Now I think I forgot the question.
And to be fair, you do talk about gentrification in the book, absolutely, and Williamsburg factors in too, right? But if there are other ways in, and in fact, maybe if you don't want to answer that, there's also another question from Michael Busch, which is, can you talk about the ways in which gender dynamics factor into your analysis of the hipster?
Yeah, that's definitely that's and God knows Bhakti killed me for this. That's definitely something I could have talked about more as well. Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting dimension. This is the conversation we've had with Bhakti that are now revealed to the world. Bhakti kept saying, you have to talk about canning and mason jars and the urban gardening and all these things that are not just that were eminent and that still are eminently gendered. Even though it wasn't just about women. It was very gendered in the discourse, and it's also the sort of a proto-feminist recuperation of those activities that were gendered for many of them, right? If they weren't for hipsters, they certainly were historically. And I think part of the way that got recycled certainly played with gender dynamics. So that's not really in the book, but we had those conversations with Bhakti quite a few times, and she has a point. She should have listened, but whatever. That's a different story. But yeah, there would be a lot to say about this, especially because I think one of those dynamics is hardly the only one, but I do think those recuperation of the sort of old-timey domestic activities, at least symbolically, really participates also in this sort of conservative / fascist turn. And I still, again, I don't have a full-fledged analysis of this, but to me, not by chance is that also opened the door to this sort of new, cool, sexist fascism that, again, I'm thinking of examples in France, but they're everywhere, that is often bandied by women, right? And then this sort of domesticity is cool. And I think, again, that's not all of it, but in very interesting ways, it does, that discourse rests on the sort of, at least is made possible to some extent by the hipsterization of some, of certain old forms of domesticity, if that makes sense. I feel like I'm not being very articulate, but I think there's a lot more to be said about that I did not say in the book. So that was your question. That is definitely a chapter that could have been. There are other chapters. I'm mostly focused on Black diasporic culture. Obviously, that is not the only culture that's being co-opted and borrowed and appropriated by hipsters. So those are other chapters that could have been. But again, this wasn't supposed to be too long a book, so I didn't know some of the many things I ended up not talking about.
No, I'm getting feedback. Is that me or you? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, maybe we'll just go to you. Oh no, now it's gone. I wanted to go to you reading, but I think they figured out the sound. So I do want to maybe just think about before we go to your reading. And do you have a passage that you want to read?
I did not have time to think about a passage.
Oh, all right. Well, there's another question. So one more question while you think about it, and then we'll go to a reading. So this is from Michael O'Regan. While hipster aesthetic is very visible in popular culture, do other capital bearers, tourists, international students, Russian money in the housing sector, have more of an impact on gentrification?
On gamification or
gentrification? Oh, gamification. Interesting. I have that as gentrification because we're talking about the housing sector. So
right. I'm guessing. And so the answer is yes. I'm sure. I mean, again, right? It's not like hipsters are not the guilty of everything, right? They're not the whipping boy here, the scapegoat. And yes, of course, there's more money and there are more actors involved here. Again, I'm talking in some ways and focusing almost exclusively on cultural capital in this case, right? And part of again, part of the point of the book and part of what I'm doing with, maybe too narrow a focus, it's the book's not about gentrification, right? So, I mean, if I were to write one, which I would not because I'm certainly not a specialist, but yeah, there would be more to say than just talk about artists and hipsters. What I was interested in was showing how artists and hipsters more specifically do get involved in gentrification. While that might not seem, I think it's fairly obvious, actually. I mean, it's been a conversation, certainly, when you talk about Brooklyn. But yeah, no, I mean, yeah, Michael.
I think there's this, and this was, again, a book club discussion, but I think it's really worth thinking about how that, not just gentrification, but sort of some of the phenomena that you look at, look like one thing in their sort of initial, or one of their, maybe we could say earlier waves of sort of presence in the popular cultural sphere, and how, I'm thinking about just Washington, DC real estate, how what would have been a place where artists and hipsters would have been useful, for example, or right to in order to make a neighborhood, for the next group of people. Now it's actually just real estate sort of, and the market itself, like marketing something that looks hipstery, but it never was. And they just create new neighborhoods and make names for them. And so it's an interesting way that has already gotten, it's no longer even about sort of people and their potential cultural appropriation. It's about a market that just creates its own opportunities to gentrify.
Yeah, and I think here again, I mean, I think Sarah Schulman, who I quote in the book, certainly has a much better analysis than I could give. That I think ties to Michael's question, which is like the hipster aesthetic. I think allows and hides those other dynamics at hand, right? I mean, as you say, there's a way in which it doesn't even have to be truly. Like, it doesn't have to be about hipsters. It just has to look like it's about hipsters. And at some point, maybe it is. I was saying earlier, again, I mentioned Dennis Sinnett, who writes about the gentrification of Brooklyn. And he mentioned how, many people who he would certainly define as hipsters sort of use this language of oppression, right? That you talk about the whatever problems they're facing. I'm guessing with renters, with maybe those capital bearers that Michael mentions. But yeah, they're using the aesthetic precisely to do whatever they want, right? Like it's a sign that's been emptied of any meaning in this sense. And to me, what's interesting, and to go back to Schulman, is just she says, but the stages to this, you may start with actual artists. And by the time they help make gentrification possible, those artists themselves are being pushed out. Right? They're made to represent something that they don't embody. Right? She says, like, for all, like, when we think of I don't know, 80s New York City, no wave, whatever, even what I have in mind. She said, well, for all the 10, 20, 30 names that there's hundreds that have completely fallen by the wayside that you never saw because they were so unsafe for mainstream culture that nobody remembers them, and they've never made it even halfway into mainstream culture. Even our memory of radical culture is also packaged, right? In this, so I think
we dropped that like 5 minutes before the end, but
yeah. But so capital bearers, like tourists, whatever. Yeah, you may see them, but like I would imagine part of what they do is actually try not to be seen, right? And so in this sense, hipster aesthetics matter. Precisely because they've become sort of shorthand for gentrification, and very willfully, right? By people who know what, right?
That was great. So yes, I just want to reiterate that you were alluding to, and when that is in your book, that when maybe you could just re-say it, that what we understand or our concept of what is radical is itself sort of packaged or determined. It's not. Yeah, that is, I think, a crucial piece of the discussion. But let's go to your reading. We'd love to hear you and your voice read some of this.
Okay, so maybe I'll skip part of this, but maybe I'll read something that's close to the end. That starts with a question that might sound familiar. And so, can we decolonize hipsters? Good question. How do you decolonize the colonial army? Disbanding seems like a place to start, maybe, except it has long been the hipster MO to melt away in the greater population, Kaiser Soze style, when every doofus in the room has finally figured out what the deal was. But occupation may become less ostentatious, it may become less newsworthy. The occupying army never actually goes anywhere. The hipster moment is over, but former hipsters did not stop being so overnight. They have grown now. They've slowly retreated from the front lines of cultural wars and taken off their uniforms, but they're not done. Many have simply turned into nice white parents and moved on to destroying public education or urban farming, and also repaving the streets they took over with good intentions, among other hobbies. They may be redeemable, but let's not hold our breath. Worth still is that we can and should expect the hipster army to rise again when good things come back. So how can we avoid that? I'll be frank, there is no easy answer here beyond imagination. There is nothing we should strive to save in hipsterdom as we know it. The cycle of appropriation, digestion, and regurgitation of cool is racism and capitalism in action. Kill capitalism and you decolonize hipsters. There, done. All right, maybe I'll stop here. Or maybe there is a lesson to be learned from history near and far. Maybe there is something to be gleaned from Schulman's friends, the unsung artists who moved to New York to become New Yorkers rather than to colonize, who made uncompromising art inseparable from political movements. Maybe we can start again at the beginning, at the attraction one may feel for a culture they did not grow into, but nevertheless, maybe against all odds, feel sincerely partial to, whatever makes one dance to a beat, sing to a song, nod to a painting, which may not totally be explained away by upbringing and social formatting, which even flies in the face of this programming. In Mumbo Jumbo, Ishmael Reed described Just Grew, a virus which, if it becomes pandemic, will mean the end of civilization as we know it. That's apocalyptic. This one may hit too close to home in times of COVID, but bear with me. The virus symptom in the novel is an uncontrollable urge to dance that might evoke the dancing plague of 1518, except Just Grew is an anti-plague. It does not kill, it saves. Not like the holy black tea Marinetti found in the mud of a factory gutter in his feverish dreams of racist exploitation, but like a black tide of mud with the potential to engulf us all and give the old world new life. The dance crazes of the jazz era, that was Just Grew on the offensive, contaminating the youth, a phenomenon the Wallflower Order, the age-old secret society of whiteness, recognizes exactly for the existential threat that it is. Today your ass, tomorrow your mind, and then the world. The danger of Black culture is that it may convince people that there are better things to do with oneself than whiteness. We can't have that. In the novel, the Wallflower Order manages to thwart Just Grew, notably by putting some stiff academic moves on it. Black intellectuals chaperoned by white eminence grise contain Just Grew with the best worded intentions. They codify dance steps into manuals. They say what's good and what isn't. They put some fig leaves on humping crotches and all goes back to normal. Hipsters never stood a chance. Or did they? There is a moment there when the virus hits and all that matters is the act of dancing, singing, having sex, a politics of joy and community. Famed anarchist thinker Emma Goldman had exactly this in mind when, responding to a comrade berating her for a tendency to slay on the dance floor, she told him that our cause could not expect me to become a nun and that the movement would not be turned into a cloister. If it meant that, I did not want it. I want freedom, the right to self-expression, everybody's right to beautiful, radiant things. Free your ass, your mind will follow. There, buried near the roots of hipsterdom, so close it can almost touch it, is an act more than a pose, a moment rather than an attitude, when being hip still means knowing what's up, and what's up is revolution. Under the layers of snark and self-consciousness and cool, maybe the hippening is and has always been happening. I don't know how long to wait for me to stop here. Thank you.
That was fantastic. All right. So this concludes this book launch, but that doesn't mean that it has to end because everyone who hasn't gotten the book can go get it. There are links in the that were available, but also hopefully continue discussion about this. It is provocative. Here we go. Get your copy. Thank you so much. Congratulations, Greg. This is really exciting. And thanks
Thank
again.
you all for being here. Thanks to everyone for organizing this, Radical Book Collective, Chelsea for showing up, Bhakti, Paulus, Project Warscapes. You're great. Our books also, of course, for actually publishing this. That was nice. And yeah, everybody that I cannot see, but that may be out there in the ether. Thanks for being here. This was great.
Great. Thanks, everyone.